General Hospital spoilers tease that beneath the low hum of a flickering street lamp in a shadowed corner of Port Charles. Vaughn stood in a silence so dense it felt like the air itself refused to move. Jocelyn's eyes, wide with confusion and a rising tide of dread, locked onto him as if searching for the punchline to what she hoped was some cruel joke. But there was no humor in Vaughn's expression, only the deep, haunted weight of a man who had held on to too many secrets for far too long. And then, with a quiet breath that trembled just enough to betray the storm inside him, he said it. Not as an excuse. Not as a plea, but as a truth carved into the marrow of his soul. Dex was his brother. The words crashed into Jocelyn's mind like a tidal wave against fragile glass, tearing apart the careful narrative she had forced herself to believe ever since Dex's supposed death. But before she could even begin to process that devastating revelation, Vaughn dropped something even darker. Dex had never died. He had faked his death under orders from the highest ranks of the PCPD, entering a clandestine operation so deeply buried in secrecy that even Vaughn, his own blood, had been kept at the margins of it until recently. The story unfurled like a noose tightening with every sentence. Dex had been marked for death by the very people he was investigating, an underground faction splintering off from the criminal ecosystem of Port Charles, burrowed so deeply that rooting them out required disappearing completely. Vaughn had been assigned, indirectly, to cover the fallout, to infiltrate the WSB, to maintain the illusion, to manipulate grief. And he had done it. He had watched Jocelyn weep at Dex's memorial with eyes that burned from holding back his own truth. He had stood beside Sonny, hiding his revulsion for the man who had dragged his brother into the fire in the first place. He had worked closely with Jason, always on edge, always resisting the urge to ask if he knew. If any of them knew, or if they were all just blind to the deeper operation unfolding beneath their feet. But it was Jocelyn who haunted him the most. Because it was her who loved Dex with a kind of reckless purity, and it was her who would feel the deepest betrayal, not just from the man who vanished, but from the one who stayed and never told her the truth. Jocelyn staggered back, as if physically struck by Vaughn's confession, and he reached out instinctively, only to freeze halfway, as if fearing his touch might fracture her further. Her mind raced, every moment of mourning, every sleepless night, every time she whispered Dex's name into the dark, all of it had been for a lie. Her tears had been real, her pain unbearable, and yet all this time, he had been alive. Somewhere. Watching. Fighting. Hiding. Her stomach twisted with nausea and rage. She wanted to scream. To hit Vaughn, to demand answers he couldn't possibly give. Because now that she knew, the danger wasn't just real, it was immediate. Her knowledge alone could unravel everything Dex had risked his life to protect. And then came the realization that terrified her most. This wasn't just about a long-lost brother or a fake death. It was about something much bigger. Vaughn hadn't told her this out of guilt or empathy. He had told her because she was about to be pulled in whether she wanted to or not. The mission Dex was on was shifting, becoming unstable, and the walls were closing in. The enemy was no longer some distant syndicate in the shadows. They were here. Inside the city. Inside the systems. Possibly even inside the WSB itself. Vaughn knew Jocelyn would be a target the moment she learned the truth, but withholding it any longer could have been fatal. And then came the final blow. Vaughn whispered something even more devastating than the truth of Dex's survival. He told her that Dex had asked about her often. That in the brief and rare moments of contact, Dex's only concern was that Jocelyn would never forgive him. That the burden of breaking her heart was the one thing Dex said he could never reconcile. Vaughn revealed that Dex had once begged him to deliver a letter, a final message, but it had been intercepted and destroyed before it could reach her. And now, Vaughn feared. The final stages of the operation were beginning. There might not be another chance for goodbyes. There might not be any reunions at all. Jocelyn's knees buckled, and this time Vaughn caught her. Not out of triumph, not to console, but because the truth had finally broken something inside her, and he knew it. In that moment, every path forward was twisted in thorns. She could betray the mission and expose Dex to danger. She could join Vaughn, and by extension the lie. Or she could walk away and pretend none of it mattered. Though every cell in her body screamed otherwise. What she didn't know, not yet, was that there were others who knew the truth. Sunny. Jason. Even Carly. All of them playing their own games of silence and sacrifice. And now that she knew, the clock had begun ticking on something far darker, because secrets in Port Charles don't just fester. They explode. Underneath the crimson-tinged twilight that cloaked Port Charles in a deceptive serenity, Jocelyn found herself locked in a state of disbelief so profound it was almost paralyzing. Vaughn's voice still echoed in her ears, each syllable cascading like a tidal wave across the fragile foundation of her reality. The man standing before her, who had once seemed enigmatic but trustworthy, had just confessed that he was Dex's brother, and more than that, he was the son of Jason Morgan. The same Jason who had once been her protector. The same Jason who had walked in and out of her life like a shadow that never quite disappeared. But now, that shadow had a past drenched in secrets that made Jocelyn's chest tighten with the weight of betrayal. Vaughn wasn't just any man. He was the byproduct of everything Jason had kept hidden. And Dex, her Dex, was alive. The words Vaughn uttered, Dex faked his death. It was part of a mission. But he didn't leave without a plan. I was the plan. Sent a chill crawling down her spine. For months she had mourned Dex. She had cried in silence, clutched onto memories like lifelines, and cursed the heavens for taking away the one man who had truly understood her. But it had all been a lie. A strategic illusion designed to protect something greater than either of them. Dex had disappeared, not out of fear or failure, but out of loyalty, loyalty to their shared bloodline, loyalty to Jason, loyalty to a mission that was still cloaked in mystery, not to offer comfort or closure, but to ignite a new war born from the ashes of that lie. What made the revelation even more devastating was the fact that Vaughn didn't speak with the sorrow of a brother who had lost something. He spoke with the precision of a man who had gained clarity. He had stepped into the storm Dex left behind and decided not to escape it, but to harness it. Vaughn had spent months digging through the shadows of WSB records, forging alliances with operatives who had once worked alongside Jason, tracking down former enemies who remembered the name Morgan not with fear, but with hatred. And with every layer of history he unearthed, Vaughn discovered just how deep the fractures in Jason's legacy truly ran. Dex and Vaughn had been watching from the outside. Castaways of a family they never knew. Sons raised in silence, trained in conflict, destined to become weapons. And Vaughn, unlike Dex, didn't seek redemption, he sought revolution. Jocelyn could see it in his eyes now, the quiet storm gathering behind his pupils. He wasn't here to reconnect with family. He was here to dismantle it. And in doing so, he had dragged Jocelyn into a web so intricate, so ruthlessly calculated, that she couldn't tell whether she was the target or the catalyst. Worse still, Vaughn wasn't acting alone. He had revealed that there were others, operatives, allies, perhaps even family, who had kept Dex hidden, protected, preparing for the right moment to strike. The PCPD wasn't just passively aware of the conspiracy. They were deeply entrenched in it. And within those walls of secrecy, Jocelyn began to see the terrifying truth: this wasn't just a mission. It was a takedown. And at the heart of it was Jason Morgan, the father who had never raised them, never acknowledged them, never warned them of what legacy truly meant. But Vaughn's vengeance wasn't limited to Jason. He blamed Sunny just as much. Because it was Sunny who had pulled Jason into the criminal underworld. Sunny who had made sure that everything Jason touched turned to danger. And in Vaughn's mind, it was Sunny who ensured that the lives of his sons, Dex and Vaughn, were shaped by abandonment, violence, and secrets. Jocelyn, who had once stood by Sunny as family, as protector, now felt the tide turning. The man who had raised her, sheltered her, might be complicit in creating the monsters that now stood ready to devour Port Charles. And the final blow, the thing that made Jocelyn's breath catch in her throat, was the truth about Carly. Vaughn confessed that she had received a package. Months ago. A collection of files, photos, and notes from a WSB informant. It included evidence not just of Dex and Vaughn's parentage, but of Jason's time abroad, his contact with Britt, and his disappearances that coincided with the births of children no one had ever spoken of. Carly had known. Or at the very least, suspected. And she had chosen silence. Jocelyn's world, once defined by loyalty and family, now fractured into sharp, splintering pieces. She was the daughter of Carly. The former lover of Dex. The reluctant confidant of Vaughn. And somehow, she was trapped in a legacy shaped by Jason, the man she had once considered a father figure. Every relationship in her life now felt tainted by secrets. She didn't know who to trust. And more frighteningly, she didn't know who she would become by the time this was over. Vaughn wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't seeking redemption. He was here to finish what Dex started, and to make sure the world knew who Jason Morgan truly was. Not the silent enforcer. Not the stoic hero. But the architect of a generation born in silence and raised in shadows. Vaughn intended to burn down the myth of Jason. And Jocelyn? She stood at the edge of the fire, trying to decide if she would extinguish the flames, or add fuel to them. Because deep down, in the silence that followed Vaughn's confession, Jocelyn felt something she never expected, understanding. Not agreement. Not forgiveness. But a dark, unsettling recognition of the truth. Vaughn wasn't insane. He was hurt. He was broken. And he had been forged by the very man they both once believed in. And perhaps the scariest realization of all was this: if Jason truly had other children, if Vaughn and Dex were just the beginning, how many other ghosts was Jason hiding? How many more truths were waiting to explode? Port Charles would never be the same. Because Vaughn wasn't just revealing secrets. He was rewriting bloodlines. And the war for truth, family, and identity had only just begun. Dex's reappearance in Port Charles was more than a shocking twist. It was a psychological rupture that shattered the fragile reality Jocelyn had barely managed to piece together. After months of mourning, of sleepless nights plagued by the echo of a gunshot she never witnessed but always imagined, of wondering what she could have done differently to keep him alive, Jocelyn had finally started to accept his absence as permanent. The grief had hardened into a quiet sorrow, one she carried like a wound beneath the surface. But that wound was ripped open when Vaughn, with an expression both cautious and cold, revealed the truth: Dex was not dead. He had never been dead. He had faked his own death as part of a classified operation initiated by the PCPD. Disappearing into the shadows to complete a mission so secretive that even those closest to him were deemed expendable in the pursuit of silence. For Jocelyn, the betrayal wasn't just in the deception, it was in the willingness. Dex had chosen this path. He had allowed her to suffer, to break. To become someone else entirely in the wake of his supposed death. Every tear, every breakdown, every scream into her pillow at night had been a solitary sentence in a story whose ending had already been written without her consent. Vaughn's confession, though calm on the surface, detonated inside her mind. Not only had Dex faked his death, he had done it with the full support of the institution she once believed stood for justice. Worse. Vaughn admitted something even more chilling: he and Dex were brothers. Half-brothers. Sons of the same woman, but raised in parallel worlds. Vaughn had spent years chasing fragments of his family, quietly watching from afar as Port Charles grew more toxic and unstable. Now, those fragmented truths were bleeding into each other, and Jocelyn was caught in the crossfire. The revelation that Dex and Vaughn shared a mother, an unknown woman who had kept both boys separated for their safety, was enough to unmoor Jocelyn's sense of place in their world. But it didn't stop there. Vaughn revealed that Jason was Dex's father. Which meant that Dex and Vaughn, in some twisted sense, were tied to the same man Jason had always considered himself to be. Protector, soldier, father figure. And now, the implications were staggering. Vaughn had spent months using this information to quietly manipulate the tides of power in Port Charles. Every move he made, every alliance he forged, had been with this larger truth in mind. And now that Dex was back, the storm they were about to unleash would be biblical. But Jocelyn couldn't focus on the political fallout, not yet. She was still trying to breathe. She was still trying to understand how the man she had once loved, trusted, and defended with her entire soul had turned into a phantom working in secret, willing to let her believe he had died. The emotional violence of that truth was unbearable. Worse, it wasn't over. Vaughn, driven by a hunger for justice, and perhaps revenge, confessed that Dex's return was part of a greater plan. Together, they intended to dismantle the empires built by Sunny and Jason. They would use everything they had, information, blood ties, institutional backing, to bring down the men who had shaped their lives in ways they could no longer tolerate. And Jocelyn, whether she wanted to or not, was now a part of it. There was something unnerving about Vaughn's calm. He didn't tremble with grief or fury. He was composed, methodical. As though he had spent years preparing for this moment. He didn't want to destroy Jason and Sunny out of blind rage. He wanted to end the cycle. He wanted to rewrite the legacy of betrayal with a fire so cleansing that nothing would remain. And Jocelyn, somewhere deep inside, recognized that same fury in herself. She had defended Jason and Sunny in the past. She had believed in them. But now, after everything, she began to wonder, how many lies had they told her? How many truths had they buried to protect their version of peace? Dex, when he finally faced Jocelyn, didn't beg for forgiveness. His voice was tired. His eyes dimmed by shadows that hadn't been there before. He told her that the mission wasn't over. That he couldn't explain everything. That he had made choices no one should have to make. But Jocelyn heard none of it. All she could see was the man who had let her believe he was dead, who had walked away without a word. Who had turned love into leverage for a cause she couldn't understand. Her heart twisted in her chest as she realized something truly terrifying. She no longer knew if she wanted him back. And in the distance, a darker truth loomed. Jason, now aware that Dex was his son, found himself caught in an emotional war he could not navigate. His stoicism cracked under the weight of paternity and betrayal. The son he didn't raise had returned with vengeance in his blood. The city he once protected was on the brink of collapse, and Jocelyn, his surrogate daughter in many ways, was at the center of the chaos. And Sunny, growing more paranoid by the day, began to sense that the war was no longer external. It was coming from within. Every relationship in Port Charles was shifting. Every truth was poisoned. Vaughn and Dex weren't just seeking revenge, they were executing justice as they defined it. And Jocelyn, once the heart of this emotional triangle, was now splintering into something new, something colder. She couldn't unsee what had been revealed. She couldn't unlove what had been taken from her. But she could make choices. She could find power in pain. And she could decide, once and for all, whose side she was truly on. Because in a city built on secrets, the only thing more dangerous than love was truth. And the truth was finally bleeding through. Jason and Sunny had always believed they could withstand any storm that came for Port Charles. Any threat from the outside world. They had faced the wrath of mob families, WSB turncoats, corrupt officials, and ghosts from their own pasts. But what they never expected, what neither of them was prepared for, was a storm born from within, from blood and legacy twisted into vengeance. As the layers of deception begin to unravel, Jason can no longer deny the feeling that Vaughn, a young man once believed to be just another drifter walking the blurred lines of Port Charles, holds far more power than anyone ever anticipated. And the most terrifying part of that truth is not what Vaughn knows, but who he is. Vaughn's confession to Jocelyn changes everything. With chilling calm, he reveals that he is Dex's older brother. Born of a mother Jason never knew had carried his child. The pieces begin falling into place, the precision in Vaughn's moves, his uncanny ability to stay 2 steps ahead. The way he infiltrated the lives of key players in Port Charles without making a sound. He wasn't simply seeking revenge, he was fulfilling a long-orchestrated plan that Dex had started years ago. A plan that had been set into motion from the shadows after Dex faked his death and disappeared under the protective umbrella of a secret PCPD operation. Vaughn had stepped into the void, carrying the mission forward with even more coldness, with one goal: to dismantle the empire that had shaped their father and destroyed their family. Jocelyn, upon hearing this, doesn't just feel shock, she feels betrayed. Everything she had believed, every emotion she had poured into Dex, every wall she let down for Vaughn, it now feels like manipulation. She realizes she was never more than a pawn on the chessboard of revenge, and yet she can't pull herself away from the truth that Vaughn is not just a ghost of Dex's past, but flesh and blood of Jason, the man she once saw as her protector. Her entire worldview begins to collapse. Vaughn had never come into her life by accident. He had been watching, planning, calculating every interaction. Meanwhile, Jason and Sunny are drowning in a new kind of paranoia. For years, Jason had compartmentalized pain, buried memories, and distanced himself emotionally to survive the darkness that surrounded him. But now, that darkness has taken on a form. Vaughn is not just an enemy, he is his son. And if that weren't enough, the reappearance of Dex threatens to fracture the fragile remnants of trust holding the Corinthos organization together. Sunny sees in Vaughn the same traits that made Jason dangerous in his youth: loyalty warped into obsession, love weaponized into control. The lines are blurring. Vaughn isn't out for power. He's out for reckoning. And in the shadows, the threat is evolving. Vaughn and Dex are not alone. There are whispers of a network forming around them: disillusioned ex-WSB agents, rogue PCPD officers, former allies of Cyrus, and those who have quietly suffered under Sunny's rule and Jason's dominion. Vaughn is recruiting not with promises of wealth, but with promises of justice, retribution, and revolution. He is crafting a narrative: 2 sons, born in silence, abandoned by a father who chose power over paternity, returning not to reclaim his name, but to burn it to the ground. Jason tries to fight the tide, tries to rationalize, to find a way back from the ledge. But every piece of evidence he gathers only tightens the noose. Vaughn is 10 steps ahead. He knows the hidden bank accounts, the off-the-grid safe houses, the identities of every informant and supplier Jason has ever used. How? Because Dex left him the playbook. Because Vaughn has lived every day training for this war. And now, with Dex preparing to step back into the light, it won't be long before they strike. Sunny urges Jason to make the hard call. Eliminate Vaughn before he tears the entire structure apart. But Jason hesitates. Vaughn isn't just a threat. He's family. And though Jason has taken lives to protect the people he loves, he's never been forced to choose between protecting the world he built or killing the son he never knew he had. The emotional paralysis begins to eat at him. Every time he sees Jocelyn's face, the betrayal in her eyes, the way she questions him without words, he feels it. The weight of the past. The crushing guilt of a father who never knew. And the terror of what a son grown in hatred is capable of. Dex's return only accelerates the chaos. His calm, haunting presence begins sending shockwaves through Port Charles. He's no longer the reckless enforcer who once protected Sunny. He is colder now, more detached, as if every part of him that loved has been surgically removed and replaced with purpose. His allegiance is not with Sunny. Not with Jason. It's with Vaughn, and the mission. Together, they plan to unveil secrets that will destroy the Corinthos legacy. Together, they want to make Jason pay, not just for what he did, but for what he failed to do. And so Jason begins the most painful journey of his life, to uncover the extent of Vaughn's plot. To track the alliances forming around him, and to find the last remaining pieces of humanity left in a war that's turning familial blood into currency. He digs into old files, tracks down former lovers, confronts people he once pushed away, all to answer a question that he cannot shake. What if this is his fault? Jocelyn, too, is caught in the middle. Torn between the betrayal of her past love and the danger of her present reality, she tries to piece together the truth behind Vaughn's rage. She discovers letters Dex wrote before he disappeared. Evidence of surveillance files with her name circled in red, recordings of her conversations that only someone deeply obsessed could have kept. She begins to realize, this is not just about revenge. This is about possession. Vaughn doesn't just want to destroy Jason, he wants to own what Jason never cherished. And that means Jocelyn. As the storm thickens, Jason and Sunny find themselves facing the greatest threat they've ever known, not from a rival mob, not from federal agents, but from within their own bloodlines. Vaughn and Dex are not just enemies. They are consequences. Manifestations of choices made in the dark, come to collect their due. And unless Jason can stop them, Port Charles may not survive what is coming next.